All right, entering calc students, welcome to Yak Math videos for video number 3 for your quick review really over trigonometry. I might have some videos in a few weeks talking over some concepts we're going to go over in those first 3 weeks of class, those first 3 to 4 weeks of class, so you guys can be really sharp on those. We are actually going to talk about the unit circle this time. You guys learned about the special values, so to speak, in the unit circle. I'm going to give you the actual unit circle and I highly recommend that you print it out so you can memorize it this summer and early on in the semester, because it's something we just have to have memorized. All right, so let's say a radius is 1. You know from geometry that the circumference of a circle is 2 pi radius. So if a circle has a radius of 1, the circumference is 2 pi. You guys also know that there's 360 degrees in a circle. All right, this is fact. 360 degrees is equal to 2 pi radians. So 180 degrees is equal to pi radians. Please write that down. You might be asking, I understand the whole 2 pi and the 360, but you've added in this word radians there. What does that mean? That is new for you. A radian is a unit of angle, a way to measure an angle is degrees. There's also minutes, seconds, unit of angle. That is a radian, equal to, now this is weird, I'm going to show you what it means in a drawing here, equal to an angle at the center of a circle, all right, center of a circle, whose arc is equal in length to the radius. So here's a circle, that's the radius. Now this radius is equal, straight line here, this radius is equal to the same length as this curve. So when the radius in the unit circle, the radius is 1, is equal to the arc length, which would also be 1 in the unit circle, you have 1 radian. Okay, and then you can figure out what a radian is. If you know what pi is, it's 3.14. 180 divided by pi, it's in the 50 degrees. So a pi radian is roughly 50-ish, like 57 degrees or something. Again, just divide by 3.14. All right, so the big takeaway here is when we do work in calculus, not a lot of it is using degrees. You're going to have to evaluate like cosine pi fourths, cosine -7 pi thirds, something like that. It's not going to be in degrees. Okay, so 30 degrees is how many pi radians? All right, so first off, 180 and pi, they represent the same thing. 180 degrees is the same thing as pi radians. So we're going to do multiplication either with the ratio 180 over pi radians, because that's the same thing, or pi radians divided by 180 degrees. That is the same thing. Okay, it's like multiplying by 1 over 1. So if I want to go from degrees to radians, I need to make sure the degrees is down below. You guys do this in science a lot to get the units that you want. And we usually just don't put the radians here. We just leave it on. We just divide. We multiply by pi over 180 or 180 over pi. All right, we'll just leave it at the end. 30 degrees is the same thing as pi 6th radians because I multiplied by pi over 180. 30 over 180 is a 6th. Pi stays up top. So you're going to have to know next year when I'm talking about 30 degrees that that's the same thing as pi 6, okay, and vice versa. But more like this, all right? We're going to be doing a lot in radian form. So on your calculator, you have degree form and degree mode and radian mode. We'll be using, we'll be talking about radians a lot this year. 135 degrees, I want degrees gone, so 180 at the bottom, pi up top. 135 divided by 180 is 3/4, so 3 pi fourths radians, or 3/4 pi radians, 3/4 pi radians. All the same thing. All right, we're going to actually look at the unit circle now. Let me talk about families. So here is what the unit circle is. You guys can just Google unit circle PDF, and you'll see things like this. The unit circle is a circle of radius 1. All right, radius 1 here. When I talk about drawing circles in, used to be geometry or algebra 2, go 1 to the right, 1 up, 1 left, and 1 down. I know I covered that with you entering calculus students. All right, radius of 1. So, big thing to take away also, so in x, y, you learn this in physics, but cosine theta corresponds with x, sine theta corresponds with y, horizontal and vertical displacement there. You'll talk about that in physics. Okay, so on the unit circle, you have 30 degrees is the same thing as pi 6 radians. We just went over that. And this point right here, we can figure out by doing cosine of 30, root 3 over 2, and then sine of 30, or sine of pi 6, which is 1/2. Root 3 over 2, 1/2. Root 2 over 2. Root 2 over 2, comma, root 2 over 2, and so forth. Now, notice, you're going to see a lot of 0, 1, or negative 1. You're going to see a lot of 1/2s. Root 3 over 2, root 2 over 2, or it's opposite. Because the unit circle gives you these cardinal values, these special values here in different families. And we're going to talk about those families. Then it starts over again, all right? Starts over again at 0 or 2 pi, okay? 2 pi is 360 degrees. If you go 360 degrees, then you're just back at your starting point, okay? So, again, all the way up on the y-axis, 90 degrees, all the way down, 270. All the way to the left is 180. Back is 0 or 360. 0 is the same thing as 2 pi. Let's talk about these families. It is going to be important for you to memorize these families. All right, so the first family we saw on the unit circle is the pi 6th family. And in the pi 6th family, cosine is always plus or minus root 3 over 2. Sine is always plus or minus 1/2. Now, to figure out what else is in the pi 6th family, keep adding. Start with 1 over 6 and keep adding a 6th. Now, if you add a 6 plus a 6, you get 2 6. Well, that reduces, so that's not in the pi 6 family. Add another 1 6, you get 3 over 6. That reduces, so that's not in the family. Add another 1 over 6, you get 4 over 6. That reduces, that's not in the family. Add 1 6 to 4 6, you get 5 pi 6, which doesn't reduce. That is the next thing in the pi 6 family. That is in the second quadrant. In the second quadrant, x, which is cosine here, is always negative, and y, which is sine here, is always positive. All right, so cosine of 5 pi 6 would be negative root 3 over 2. Sine of pi 6 is 1/2. Then I continue, add another pi 6, you get 6 over 6, which is 1. That's not in the family. Add another pi 6, you get 7 pi over 6, which is not simplified. That is in the third quadrant. In the third quadrant, x is negative and so is y, so they're both negative. But cosine is always root 3 over 2, either plus or minus, and sine is always 1/2, either plus or minus. That's a nice thing. If you memorize these families, you know that, okay, sine is plus or minus 1/2, cosine is plus or minus this. You get 8 over 6 reduces, 9 over 6 reduces, 10 over 6 reduces, 11 over 6 does not reduce. That's in the fourth quadrant there, the last one in the pi 6 family. In the fourth quadrant, cosine is positive while sine is negative. Add another pi 6, you get 2 pi, which is back to 0. Next one in the family is pi 4ths, that's 45 degrees. These all come from the special right triangles we talked about in another video, and from geometry, 30, 60, and then 45, all right? Pi 4ths is 45 degrees. So the first one is pi 4ths. In the pi 4ths family, sine and cosine are either the same. They're the same in the first quadrant, and you guys know a lot about the first quadrant. That's what geometry is about. Geometry is about that first quadrant of the unit circle. Now we're using all the quadrants here in pre-calculus and again in trig, or in calculus, sorry. So plus or minus root 2 over 2, plus or minus root 2 over 2. First quadrant, everything's positive, so sine and cosine are the same. Add pi 4ths, you get 2 pi over 4, which is reduces. Add pi 4ths, you get 3 pi over 4ths, which is not reduced. That is in the second quadrant. Cosine's negative, sine is positive. Add pi 4ths, that reduces. Add another pi 4ths, that is not reduced. That's the third quadrant. Both are negative. Add pi 4ths, does reduce. Add pi 4ths, that does not. Fourth quadrant, cosine is positive, sine is negative. All right, and then we have the pi 3rds family, 60 degrees. In the pi 3rds family, again, look what's going on in the unit circle. We start well over here where you're all the way to the right. If you go to the right, that's x, and you're all the way down. I mean, you're not all the way down, but you're at 0 here for y. And as you go along the unit circle, you're slowly going to the left. So your cosine values have to get smaller. If you're going to the left, x is getting smaller, and you're slowly going up. So your y values are getting bigger, okay? That's roughly 0.866. That's roughly 0.707. That's 0.5. Then you get to 0. Okay, so it makes sense how sine will have a bigger value now than, or the y will have a bigger value than x. So sine in the first quadrant, its ratio is larger than cosine. Pi thirds family, you either have cosine is plus or minus 1/2, sine is plus or minus root 3 over 2. Okay. First quadrant, both are positive. Then add pi thirds, and it's again in the same family, 2 pi thirds. Cosine is negative, sine is positive in the second quadrant. That's 1. It reduces. This does not reduce. We're in the third quadrant. Cosine negative, sine negative. Add another third. You're in the fourth quadrant. Cosine positive, sine negative. Those are the 3 measure families. All right, so it's not terrible. We can memorize that. Let's talk about the zeros and ones, though, and those don't really require, you just got to think about where you are. If you're at 0, you're all the way to the right, so your x value is 1, and your y value, it's on the ground, so it's 0. Then at 90 degrees, you have the biggest y value you can have at 1, and cosine is 0. Then at pi at 180 degrees, you're furthest left, so cosine's negative 1, sine is 0. Then you're furthest south here at 270. Sine is negative 1 while cosine is 0. For sine and cosine, the range is negative 1, 2, 1. All right. Then if you guys are using, now you won't be able to use the TI-84s in class, but you can use, Casio, TI-36 or whatnot. If you type in cosine of 30, it's not going to give you root 3 over 2, except some of them can. I showed you that a few years ago. Some of them can. It will give you root 3 over 2. My calculator gives me 0.866. It's an irrational number. That's what root 3 over 2 is. You need to know that 0.707 is the root 2 over 2. All right. So later in the year, as it's written here, you will have to calculate something like this. 8 cosine 5 pi over 3 minus 8 cosine 5 pi over 6. You will have done the calculus like in this. I'm sure it's like integration, and you'll have to figure out what this means. So you're going to have to know, you've done a lot of work to get to here. You're going to have to know quickly, 5 pi thirds, it's in the pi thirds family, it's in the fourth quadrant. Cosine of 5 pi thirds is 1/2, minus 5 pi 6. Pi 6 5 pi 6 is in the second quadrant. Cosine is this, and then you'll do that work. Now again, one of those calculators can help you out with that. You don't know though where you're going to go to college and where the next class, especially if you're going to Calculus 2, you're going to retake Calculus 1. Some colleges don't allow you to use the calculator, so you really need to have those committed to memory. All right. Lastly, in this video, here's something else that we will do to start the review unit the first 4 weeks. All right, and it's honestly been too difficult. And this is also in some, in fact, I was just tutoring some chapter 4 stuff. You'll see this again. So this will come up. Solve for theta in 0 to 2 pi. That means find a theta on the unit circle. Okay, 0 to 2 pi. These are all thetas, 30 degrees or pi over 6. We're in radian mode here because it doesn't say 0 to 360. It says 0 to 2 pi. So you hopefully did these. This is very standard pre-calc trig here. 2 sine x or theta, in this case, minus 1 is 0. We add 1 to both sides. Okay, so you have 2 sine theta is 1. You need to figure out what sine theta is. You divide by 2. Sine theta is 1/2. This is saying find all of the angles on the unit circle that have a sine ratio of 1/2. So theta has a sine ratio of 1/2. Where? Remember, sine is the y. 1/2 is there, 30 degrees. In geometry, though, all angles were between 0 and 180, right? Or especially with right triangle geometry, when you did SOHCAHTOA, it was between 0 and 90. So, yep, 30 degrees or pi 6, but also over here, 5 pi 6. All right, so that's why we say, you know, when theta is pi 6 and 5 pi 6, we have a sine ratio of 1/2. So your answer is theta is pi 6 or 5 pi 6. Now these are going to be a challenge, not going to lie. So we're just going to do a few here, and we'll take some time in those first few weeks to go over them. This one's very similar. This time I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. Then I'm going to divide by 2. So I'm looking at cosine theta is a negative 1/2. So I'm looking for theta where its cosine ratio is negative 1/2. Again, start with, okay, cosine is x. When is x negative? X is negative in the second and third quadrants. When is my x coordinate a negative 1/2? 2 pi thirds. So it's in the pi thirds family. And 4 pi thirds. So theta is 2 pi thirds and 4 pi thirds. All right, so that is your answer. Again, if you have this down, learning it will be a lot easier. Again, I've taught this now for 3 years, and we're going to have an odd school year, so I'm trying to do everything I can to make some difficult things easier to learn. So do yourself, help yourself out, give yourself an advantage by having all these notes when we meet for the first time. All right, folks. This is Yak Math Video signing out.